Hey everybody, my name is Stan Christopoulos and you're listening to Exploring Reality, where we attempt to show the rational side of the Christian faith and show that it's true. In the last video we covered premise 1 and evidence to support it, and we actually mainly used atheistic quotes and atheistic outlooks to prove that the first premise was true. Some of you may be wondering why I didn't really talk about moral atheistic realism or anything like that, and I'm just going to save that for the next video, which is going to be objections. Today we're going to be talking about premise 2 of the moral argument, namely that objective moral values and duties exist. As a recap of what the argument is, it's a deductive argument. Premise 1 says if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists, is the conclusion. Let's go. So, premise 2 makes a pretty big claim. Objective moral values and duties exist. So naturally here, the question is, why should we think that they exist? I think that our belief in objective morality and objective moral values is on the same level as our belief in the external world of physical objects. So what I mean by that is that any argument that you give against our perception of certain moral values, objectively speaking, you could also give a parallel argument against a world of physical objects around us. Meaning that the same logic you use against any objective moral values can also be used to invalidate physical objects. If you think I'm going too far with that, these same arguments can actually go against and try to invalidate the laws of mathematics, for instance. So you'll see what I mean by that as we go on, but we have, I think, a clear understanding of the moral realm around us. In the absence of some reason to doubt our perception of physical objects, we should therefore believe that there are objective moral values, just as we have a clear perception of a world of physical objects. Again, what I mean here is that since we have no reason to doubt our perception of the external world, we therefore are rational in trusting our perception of objective morals. So if you watched the last video, you might think I'm contradicting myself because I quoted a bunch of atheists that said morality is subjective. Remember that I used what they were saying in the context of the first premise, namely that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. They agree with the first premise, and I agree with them that without God, morals are illusory and don't actually exist. They're just subjective opinions, and again, they're nothing but an illusion. But I am arguing that they are wrong when it comes to the ontology of morality. So what about Michael Ruse? In the last video, we looked at what he said, and he said that the moral values are just products of socio-biological evolution. They are just ingrained into us by this gradual process of biological and cultural development. I think that this argument against the objectivity of moral values actually commits something called the genetic fallacy. So in philosophy, the genetic fallacy is when you try to invalidate the knowledge of something by explaining how it came about. For example, if someone were to say to you, the only reason that you believe that smoking causes cancer is because you were born in the 20th century where this is the popular view, therefore your view is invalid. That would be silly. It is true that if you were born 200 years ago, you might have believed that smoking was healthy or at least didn't have negative health concerns. But simply telling you how your belief came to originate does nothing to invalidate the truth of your position. So back to how the fallacy relates to the point. The claim is that our morals came from evolution, so they must be subjective. But even if our morals did slowly evolve with evolution, it has no bearing on whether or not they exist on an ontological basis. What this means is, if moral values, for example, were gradually discovered through evolution rather than gradually invented, then mankind's gradual and error-prone understanding of the realm of objective moral values does not undermine the objectivity of the realm any more than, again, our gradual error prone to the apprehension of the world discovered by natural science undermines the objectivity of that realm. So long as moral values are gradually discovered rather than gradually invented, that is consistent with saying that they are objective. So the fact that you can show that there are cultural and even biological influences that cause you to believe in certain moral values does nothing to undermine the objectivity of those values. If you try to argue this, again, you're committing the genetic fallacy, and it actually further proves my point. So back to the question. Why should we believe that there are moral values? I think we know that objective moral values exist and that we clearly understand them. The way in which we understand them is through moral experience. If we do various thought experiments in which you are placed in moral situations and you're asked to make a decision based off an objective right and wrong, you already more than likely know the answer. I think the best way to show this is through the use of illustrations. So for example, the GOAT of Christian philosophy, William Lane Craig, uses this one, and it's actually a real story. He says he was walking through a college campus and saw a sign. It said, "Sexual abuse. No one has the right to abuse a child, woman, or man." It was put up by some sexual abuse prevention committee at the university. The sign struck him because he thought, if God doesn't exist, no atheist can actually say this. An atheist would not be able to make sense out of one's right to not be sexually abused, because if there is no God, there are no objective rights or objective moral duties, and humans don't have any intrinsic moral worth. Therefore, anyone who sees that sign and agrees that no one has the right to be sexually abused isn't doing so admitting that there is a realm of objective moral values and that they have perceived them. Clearly here, everyone knows that sexual abuse is wrong. Nobody is going to object to this. We all know it's wrong. Another real-world illustration. If you're watching this from the future, the year I'm recording this is 2020. It's probably in your history books. It's been a crazy year. So right now, there's this major movement going on in an effort to help the black community receive their basic human rights. But again, this begs the question. Under naturalism, the belief that there is no God and all that there is the natural world, that we're nothing more than just sophisticated animals, there are no basic human rights because there's no basic human right giver. Remember our last video where I showed that even atheists agree that the only way these sort of things exist is if God exists. Our country is currently taking a stand against racism because black people, just like every other human life, they have intrinsic and objective moral value. They are inherently, intrinsically valuable, and we recognize it, and we're fighting so that way they don't have to be worried about getting shot by the police or anything like that. To say otherwise is to say that what's happening is pointless. And I don't think anyone actually believes that. I think we all know that everyone has basic human rights because all people have basic objective moral value, and to infringe on these rights, especially based off of skin color, is exceptionally abhorrent. One more example. You'll notice that within our current political climate, there's a term called progressive. If you're unfamiliar, the progressive movement's goals are to promote the ideas of morality, economic reform, efficiency, and social welfare. The two that obviously stand out in the context of what we're talking about are morality and social welfare. They are all about progression in these areas. And this, again, begs the question, what are we progressing to? To what standard are we progressing to? Unbeknownst to these people, the objective moral standard. What is social welfare if objective morals don't exist? And why are we even doing it if they don't exist? The answer, because we know social welfare is good, we know that it is objectively good to increase the well-being of society and individuals. I find myself agreeing with the basic concept of progressiveness. which is at its core that we as humans should continue to progress to the objective moral standard towards the pursuit and discovery of these objective moral values. I believe that if you talk to most people and they're being sincere and honest, they'll sooner or later show where their objective moral values lie. Typically, people place a very high moral value on things like tolerance and openness and love. They think that intolerance and bigotry and racism and sexism are wrong. Let's even use the atrocities committed by the church in the name of religion. For example, the medieval crusades. Any atheists that are listening to this, or skeptics or humanists that are listening to this, do you think that was wrong? Now, is it just your opinion that that was wrong, or was it a fact that that was just wrong and everybody should agree with that statement, that the crusades were objectively wrong? Most people at the end of the day, when presented with certain types of illustrations, will give up their moral relativism and say, yeah, I guess there are really some things that are at least morally right and wrong, like torturing babies. There's a general misunderstanding here, especially amongst college students at universities, that moral relativism is the reigning view among professors. So if you don't know what moral relativism is, it's essentially the view that the atheist philosophers that I quoted in my last video hold, that morality is subjective, it's all opinion-based, and there's no objective moral standard. But in fact, studies and actual surveys show that students are more relativistic than their professors. Professors, if you ask them, actually believe in moral absolutes more than students do. Of the professors that believe these things, if you guess philosophy professors are the ones that believe these, you're right. A recent study showed that 59% of philosophy professors are moral realists. In other words, they believe that morality is objective. In a university, you may have a relativist professor assign a group study. They'll give you a moral dilemma, like your cruise ship is sinking, you're in a lifeboat with 5 people, but it's only meant to hold 4. If someone doesn't get off, you all drown. What do you do? Then they'll have you go off in groups and come up with an answer. When the groups come back, they all have different answers. Then the professor takes that situation and says, see, morality is relative. But this fatally ignores the most important part of the experiment. You're in a dilemma. The only reason you're in a dilemma in the first place is because you know that humans have objective moral value, that it's wrong to kill somebody or have them thrown off a boat. You know that their death is wrong. If it were not for the objective moral value then you wouldn't even be in the dilemma in the first place. You would just throw the skinniest person off the ship and kill the fat one for food. But you're not doing that. You're trying to find a way to make the best possible moral decision in a horrible situation. You and your group in this situation try to work out what is best for the group as a whole because you recognize that moral life has objective value. That leads into what I call moral hierarchy. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because you might be asking, well, what about when moral laws conflict? If they're objective, wouldn't they work together? So in a perfect world, yes, they would. But we live in a world where bad things happen, and so morals can conflict, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an objectively right answer. Remember, this is a question of ontology, what it actually is, versus epistemology, how we know what is. Complex issues may make things messy, and we may not even be able to find out what the best answer is, but that does not mean that there isn't a best answer. We don't live in a perfect world, which is why we have a hierarchy of moral values. For instance, we all know that lying is objectively wrong, so the relativist here will try and object by saying that it can't be objectively wrong, otherwise you wouldn't need to lie to save a person's life. This is where this whole concept of moral hierarchy comes in. Imagine you're a farmer in Poland when Nazi Germany was taking over. You're hiding Jews in your attic in order to protect them. There's a knock on the door. You see some Nazi soldiers. I don't know why I can't say that. Nazi soldiers as you open the door, and all of a sudden you hear them say, Hausinspection für Juden? That means house inspection for Jews. You let them in peacefully, knowing that there's a mother and a father and 2 little girls in your attic. You're hoping that they stay silent. As the Nazi officer walks in, what can only be explained as a sneeze is heard from the ceiling. The Nazi officer hears it and says, "Versteckst du Juden?" That means, "Are you hiding Jews in here?" What do? Lying is objectively wrong, but that family has an objective right to live and not be separated, tortured, and killed. So what are you going to do? Do you tell the truth and let them get murdered? Or do you lie to a murderer? I think the answer here is very obvious. I know that what I would do, at least, and that's that I would lie to the murderer. In this instance, you have a higher moral obligation to protect that family than you do a moral obligation to lie. This shows what I mean by a moral hierarchy. For those of you that are philosophy nerds, this is called graded absolutism. Your higher moral obligations exempt you from lower obligations in complex situations. So we can clearly see that these complex issues don't negate the fact that there is an objective right and wrong. These dilemmas prove that these objectives are real, otherwise, again, you wouldn't even be in a dilemma. And most of the moral choices we face are obvious and we don't have to think that hard about them. Now, my last point here is this. Many skeptics, and maybe even you, are thinking, there's no proof of its existence. The skeptic here is going to claim that the biggest issue is that I have no epistemological way of knowing objective morality exists. Remember here, though, that this is not the question of how we know it exists, but rather that we just know it exists. Again, how we know it exists is epistemology. The fact that we know it exists is ontology. So what the skeptic is at this point asserting is a claim with a fatal consequence with relation to literally all of reality. So I'm going to give you an example of how bad this logic actually works. In skepticism, in order to know that P is true, P representing any premise, you have to know that you know P is true. So what do I mean by that? How do you know, epistemologically speaking, that you do know something? So let's let P equal a claim, I have a physical body. How do I know, epistemologically speaking, that I do have a physical body? For all I know, I'm just a brain in a jar and a mad scientist is working on me and simulating all of reality. My thoughts, my experiences, everything are nothing but a byproduct of this mad scientist doing his magic stuff on me. The only way for me to epistemologically know and prove that I have a physical body is if I somehow was able to exit this reality I'm experiencing to test it. That's impossible. So I can't really prove, epistemologically speaking, that I'm not a brain in a jar. But I'm still rational in thinking and believing that I have a physical body, despite the possibility that maybe I am just a brain in a jar being worked on by a scientist. And the fact that I'm saying this might just be him probing my brain the right way. So we can see the absurdity in hyper-skepticism in this sense. Furthermore, why not even be skeptical about the fact that you're skeptical? I mean, if you're going to be skeptical, why not take skepticism the whole entire way and say, okay, well, I don't believe in objective morality because there's no proof, so I'm skeptical of it. But what's my epistemological reason for skepticism? I need to prove to myself that epistemologically my skepticism is warranted, but I can't. The point here is that you can believe something ontologically exists without epistemology and still be rational in our belief of something existing. In other words, we know that rationally speaking, objective morality exists, and it doesn't need to be proved for us to know that it exists. Skepticism, in this sense, falls on its own sword. So one thing that may clear up some confusion here is I said that objective values existing means that they are existing independently of our apprehension of them. But then on the other side, I am also saying that we know that they exist by the way we apprehend them. Doesn't that introduce some sort of subjectivism? To which, if you're asking that question, it's a really good question. I think it's very important that we differentiate between orders of being and orders of knowing. So when I talk about moral values being objective, I am talking about being, ontology, that these things really do exist independently of whether we apprehend them or not. But in the order of knowing, there, I think it is true that there is a good deal of subjectivity in that sometimes we are wrong. So, if this is going over your head, what I'm saying here is that there is subjectivity in how we know these objective moral values and duties, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an ultimate good. Our moral intuitions are not infallible. Neither are our sensory intuitions. So sometimes we see something like water on the highway, but it turns out it was just a mirage. The stick in the jar of water looks bent, but that's just due to refraction. We find out it's really just straight. We thought we heard something, but in fact, it was just ringing in our ears or something like that. Just as our senses are fallible and sometimes need to be corrected, I am not claiming that our moral intuitions are infallible either. This shouldn't surprise you, especially if you're a Christian, because as Christians, we believe the doctrine of original sin. We know that we live in a fallen world and are fallen ourselves. Therefore, we have a tremendous ability to rationalize bad behavior in such a way as to convince ourselves that we are really doing the right thing or the noble thing, or at least that what we're doing isn't really that bad. Sometimes we think that we are very noble and good when in fact we're acting out of selfish motives and so forth. Or other times we have moral blind spots and that later on they appear to us. I know that's happened to me a bunch of times. Just as our sight of the bent stick in the jar of water can be corrected, so is one's attitude. Say you grew up in the South and you had a racist attitude, but you never knew it until later in life. In looking back, you say, boy, I was a racist, and I'm glad I'm free of that now. So, in the area of knowing, these aren't infallible. I'm not claiming that. But what I am saying is that our senses are good enough and clear enough to know that there is at least a realm of objective moral values. And we apprehend this through moral experience, just as there's an objective realm of physical objects out there, and we apprehend it with sensory experience. Kind of proving this point, we have very clear examples of how we, as humans, justify actions against objective moral wrongs. So we have some actual very clear examples of how we as humans justify actions against objective moral wrongs. For example, murder is objectively wrong. Remember that murder is defined as the unjustified taking of a human life. The key words there, again, are human and justify. When a life is taken, people get around it by justifying it or saying that it wasn't a human life. So why do humans murder? What about the Nazis and racists and serial killers? The Nazis and racists all had something in common. They dehumanized their victims. They couldn't justify their actions to themselves if these were humans that they were torturing and killing. And if you don't believe me, look at the history books. They all dehumanized them. The Nazis dehumanized the Jews and said that they weren't human. They were animals. The racists back in the slavery days said that black people weren't humans. They were animals. They said that Jews were not people. They said that blacks were not people. So what about serial killers? Clinical psychologists nearly all unanimously agree that the reason psychopaths and other mentally ill killers can kill so mercilessly is because they all have one thing in common. There's a psychological term called objectification. They all objectify their victims. They don't have the capability of having a relationship with people because of their mental illness. So what they do instead is they literally, in their own minds, see people as objects. When you stab an object, you're not killing a person. And that's how these psychopaths see their victims. An even older example than all this is the ancient Aztecs. Ancient sources show that when they did their sacrifices, they did a dehumanization ritual in order to, again, justify the killing by dehumanizing them through this ritual. And even after they did this ritual, they still did rituals to shed themselves from the guilt of bloodshed. These examples all show that even the people that did horrendous acts knew that murder is objectively wrong, so they took one of two avenues to justify their actions, so that way what they were doing wouldn't have been wrong in their own minds. And that's it. So key takeaways: how we come to know things has no bearing on whether or not they exist. So how we come onto objective moral values and what they are doesn't hold any it doesn't hold any weight as to what they are ontologically speaking. Disagreements on what the best thing to do does not nullify that there is a best thing to do. We said that we can rationally and reasonably conclude that objective moral values exist by how easily we apprehend them. Most of the biggest secular movements of mankind are an attempt to achieve this objective moral standard of goodness through progression. And we established that there is a moral hierarchy for complex issues, and a lot more. So this was, again, the third video in the series ending our explanation and my support for the moral argument. I proved the first premise by using strictly atheist arguments rather than my own. I showed that we can know the second premise is true in this video, and so the conclusion logically follows that God exists. Next video, I'm going to cover objections. If you have any, comment them on the video with a clear, concise objection. Other than that, I'll cover the top and most common ones in the next video. As always, thank you so much. I'm so impressed with this community, the way you guys continue to grow and the way you guys continue to engage with me and with each other. Please like and subscribe, share the video. Until next time, guys. See you later.